Late afternoon light pooled across the rehearsal room at Carnegie Hall, catching on brass door handles and the beveled edges of the framed photographs lining the walls. Staff moved with the clipped purpose that came before a gala, checking place cards, testing lights, whispering through headsets. Somewhere down the corridor, a violin ran scales like a bird warming up its voice. In the center of the room sat the Steinway Model D, its lid raised like a quiet yawn, the kind of instrument people usually admired from a respectful distance. Anthony Tony Carter didn't keep that distance. He came to it the way you come to a graveside or an old friend, careful, steady, present. He wiped in slow circles, a soft cloth folded into his palm, following the grain he knew by heart. The polish smelled faintly of almond and lemon. He'd learned the little things since taking the janitor job, how dust hides along the fallboard, how fingerprints bloom at the bass end, how the pedal lyre collects tiny pieces of the day. Every pass of the cloth calmed him, and he liked work that told the truth. When something was clean, it was clean. No argument, no memory, no past. Sophie sat on a folding chair a few steps off the riser, her knees hugged to her chest, a small sketchbook propped across them. She was 8, still at that age where everything she felt was visible on her face, and the world still came as one long, curious question. She'd drawn dozens of pianos since school started, but today she tried to capture her dad's hands instead. The way his fingers curled under the cloth, the way his knuckles looked strong, but tired. She pressed her pencil harder, erased, tried again, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth like it always did when she concentrated. "You're working too hard, Peanut," Tony said without looking up. The nickname had come from when she was a baby, and her fist could wrap around just one of his fingers. "Give that paper a break." "It's not the paper," she said, sketching the chrome hinge. "The paper's fine. My hands are the ones struggling." She glanced up. "Dad, why do your hands remember that piano so much?" He paused, cloth hovering an inch above the keys. It used to be that he answered questions about pianos with a kind of simple joy. He could talk about hammers and soundboards and how spruce carried resonance like a miracle. He could tell you why the Model D felt like an ocean compared to baby grands that felt like bathtubs. But for a long time now, those answers had felt like opening a door he wasn't ready to walk through. "Hands remember all kinds of things," he said. "Tying your shoes, riding a bike, pushing a stroller up a hill on a windy day." He smiled at her, then went back to the lid edge. "Anyway, we're here to make it shine for the fancy folks." Sophie made a face. "Fancy folks don't need more shine. They have plenty." She lifted the book to compare her drawing with the real piano, then tried to get the curve of the rim right. "Do they ever say hi to you?" "Some do," he said. "Most are busy, like bees." "Bees at least make honey," she said. He chuckled under his breath. The sound warmed the air around them. "You're a tough critic." "I learned from the best." She bumped her shoulder against the chair back and pretended to be serious. "Also, I'm starving." "There's a vending machine in the hall," he said. "I can get you pretzels in a minute." "Can I go with you?" 2 minutes, he said. "After I finish the key bed. And don't go anywhere near the cables." He nodded at the snake of black lines running to the mic stands. "Trip hazard." "Roger that." She returned to the page and shaded the fallboard, whispering as she worked. "Hands remember all kinds of things." The stage manager, a woman with a headset and the kind of focused face that suggested she'd slept with a to-do list under her pillow, popped her head in. "How's it going, Tony?" "Almost done," he said. "We'll be clear in 5. "Perfect." She scanned the room, tapping notes into her tablet. "We're opening doors at 6:30. Watch your cart on the back ramp. Catering's trying to bring in another tray of crab cakes, and it's gridlock out there." Then she was gone again, radio crackling. Tony went back to work, his shoulders loosening into the rhythm. He didn't talk much about what he'd been before this, about the uniform or the practice rooms at Juilliard, or how he and Lauren saved for a stroller by skipping dinner out for months. People saw a blue polo and a name badge and decided it told them everything. He didn't have room in his chest for correcting anybody. He had Sophie to raise, rent to pay, and a job with honest edges. He was just lifting the cloth to check the reflection in the lid, clean enough to shave in, when a voice cut across the room like a fork scraping porcelain. "Well, look at that," the man said. "You'd think we brought in a conservatory professor instead of a maintenance crew." Tony didn't turn right away. He recognized the sound, performed ease with a little extra volume to make sure everyone heard. When he did look up, he saw a man in a charcoal suit tailored sharp enough to slice, a pocket square folded like a paper crane, silver hair brushed back with care. Charles Chuck Whitfield had a way of arriving like a headline. If you read arts coverage in this city, you'd run into his name often. Clever when it was flattering, ruthless when it wasn't, influential either way. He held a champagne flute he hadn't sipped yet and looked as if the room had been arranged to please him personally. "Afternoon," Tony said, neutral. Chuck's gaze ran along the piano rim, slid to the cloth in Tony's hand, then found Sophie on the folding chair. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided to be unkind. Teaching the little one proper dusting technique? Never too early to learn. He walked closer, the heels of his shoes quiet on the carpet. "Or maybe you're giving her a master class in worship. See, darling, this is what we do with the grand piano. Stroke it and whisper sweet nothings." Sophie shrank an inch. Tony angled himself just a little, enough that he sat between the man and his daughter's view. "Just doing my job, sir." "Your job," Chuck repeated, savoring it. "Right." He tilted his head toward the open lid. "Tell me, do you have any idea what you're touching there?" The staff nearby went still in the subtle way New York professionals do when they sense a show. Heads didn't whip around, but faces oriented, and conversations paused in midair. Sophie's pencil froze over the page. Tony set the cloth down, not because he was flustered, but because you shouldn't let a good cloth fall. He met the man's eyes without challenge. "I know it's a 9-foot Steinway Model D concert grand," he said quietly. "About 12,000 moving parts, depending on who's counting. Spruce soundboard, maple rim, synthetic keytops now, for ethical reasons. The plate's sandcast. Action's probably regulated weekly in a room like this. And if you're wondering about value, well, I don't know what you folks paid, but it's worth more than the car I drive." It wasn't loud, but it landed like a dropped stone in water. The room's busy surface rippled. You could feel the little change, respect, or at least interest, traveling from face to face. Chuck's mouth opened and then did nothing for a beat, and that beat was long enough for Sophie to sit up taller. "How quaint," Chuck said finally, recovering his smile. "Google has done wonders for everyone." He swiveled his flute, catching the room with his eyes again. "Keep polishing, maestro. We need everything shining tonight." Tony nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. He didn't add what he also knew, that pianos soak up the room they live in, that they remember humidity, that middle Cs on different instruments can feel like different words for the same idea. He'd learned to let the second sentence die on the way to his mouth. He turned back to the keys, and the cloth found its circle again. Sophie waited until Chuck drifted away to the bar set up near the double doors, then slid off the chair and came to the edge of the riser. "You okay?" she whispered. "I'm okay," he said. He kept his voice light. "You see? Bees all over the place." "That guy wasn't a bee," she said. "He was a mosquito." He bit the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. "Don't swat in front of donors." She looked at the piano and then at him. "How do you know all that stuff? The maple and whatever you said?" He tilted his head, letting himself look at the keys for a second longer than he usually allowed. Memories didn't arrive as full scenes anymore. They slid in as little bits. His professor at Juilliard, tapping the underside of a key with a pencil eraser. Lauren in a tiny concert dress, barefoot in their kitchen after a student recital, teasing him about keeping his wrists too high. The way a stage smelled an hour before the doors opened. "I've cleaned a lot of pianos," he said. "And before that?" she asked. "Before that I cleaned a lot of messes," he said, not unkindly. "And before that, I was your mom's husband." Sophie stared at the drawing until the lines blurred. "Do you think she could hear you? If you know?" He shook his head gently. "We don't have to ask for what we already have." He touched his chest with 2 fingers, then tapped her sketchbook. "She's in here. She's in there." He squeezed her shoulder and added, "And she'd say, 'You're shading too hard.'" Sophie huffed the tiniest laugh, then softened her pencil strokes. The hallways outside picked up volume as the hour ticked down. Carts rolling, someone arguing softly about seating charts, a cluster of college volunteers joking near the water cooler. Tony moved around the bench and checked for fingerprints on the fallboard. He placed the cloth at the end of the piano, squared the bench the way the tech liked it, and rolled his supply cart back a foot so the riser edge was clear. The stage manager reappeared, pointed her finger gun in thanks, then vanished again into the stream of never-finished tasks. A catering runner slipped by with a tray of tiny desserts. "Those are illegal," Sophie breathed. "If I snag one, we'll be banned from Midtown," Tony said. "And then where would we get good bagels?" "Queens," she said, indignant. "Fair." He lifted the handle on the cart. "Come on, pretzels for the artist." They made it only 3 steps before Chuck found an audience again. He'd pulled a small knot of guests into his orbit. Early arrivals with shiny shoes and practiced smiles. He gestured at the piano with 2 fingers as if casting a spell. "Marvelous instrument," he said, a little too loudly. "Fragile in the wrong hands, of course." "Walk," Tony said softly to Sophie. He wasn't angry. He'd learned to leave rooms instead of owning them. But then Chuck's voice pitched itself toward him again. "You there," he called, as if they'd been in mid-conversation. "Maestro Maintenance, what's your name?" Tony stopped out of politeness and turned. "Tony Carter." "Tony," Chuck repeated for the group, rolling it around like he was testing a wine. "Can you do me a favor, Tony, since you and that instrument have chemistry?" The circle of people smiled the way people do when they expect a line they'll later repeat. "Why don't you sit down and give us a taste?" The room pulled a breath. It wasn't a loud request, technically. It wasn't even framed as a joke, technically. But everyone heard the shape of it. The dare meant for a laugh, the kind that starts small and spreads mean. Someone near the door smirked. Someone else raised a phone like they were about to film a cute dog trick. Tony felt his spine do that thing where it got too straight. Sophie's hand found the back of his shirt. He could have said many things. He could have said he was on the clock. He could have said the piano wasn't his to touch. He could have said the last piece he played in front of people was the one Lauren asked for the night before she went into labor. He could have said a lot, and none of it would have mattered in the way that men like Chuck measure currency. "I'm not the entertainment," Tony said, gentle, not embarrassed, just rooted. "You'll have plenty of that tonight." "Oh, come now," Chuck coaxed, spreading his hands. "You polished it like you loved it. Let's see the passion." He tipped his head toward the bench. 1 minute, 30 seconds. Chopsticks, if you must. A few people laughed the way people laugh when they want to be safe. Sophie's fingers tightened. "Dad," she whispered. It wasn't a push. It was a question. "Are we okay?" He put his hand over hers and patted twice to say yes. "I have another room to clean," he said, still level. "Excuse me." He started to move. Chuck let the silence grow a beat and then shrugged theatrically, a gesture designed to turn a crowd. "No worries. Perhaps next time." He lifted his glass and added, "If there is a next time." Tony would remember later that this was where the room shifted again, not toward laughter, but toward curiosity. Not everyone enjoys a show when the trick feels mean. He didn't see all of it in the moment. He was guiding the cart, walking the way you walk when you've decided to leave. But he felt the tiny prickle between his shoulder blades that meant eyes followed, and he felt Sophie walking close enough that her elbow bumped the cart handle every few steps. In the service corridor, the lights were less forgiving. Sophie pretended to study a notice about recycling, but the way her mouth pressed into a hard line told him what he already knew. Kids who lose a parent become experts at reading a room. They also become experts at softness, how to land a question without shattering it. She tried anyway. Why did he talk to you like that? Some people think jobs are costumes, Tony said. He kept moving, because if he stopped, he might have to sit. They forget there's a person inside. Can't you tell them? She said. He looked at the gray linoleum, the scuff marks from 1,000 load-ins. I could, he said, but I'd rather tell you. He pushed the cart into a small closet, set the brake, and crouched so they were eye level. You know what our job is? Right now, it's to finish what we started. Then we get those pretzels you negotiated. She nodded, jaw shaking exactly once. Okay. Back in the rehearsal room, the staff had shifted the riser a few inches to the left to angle the piano toward the aisle. Tony checked for new fingerprints. There were always new fingerprints, and found 2 on the bass clef end, small ovals he wiped away in a single pass. That was another thing about this work. It rewarded attention. You put in the looking and the careful, and the world gave you back a small shine. It wasn't enough for everybody, maybe, but most days it was enough for him. Hey, Tony, the stage manager said, voice gentler than before. We're good. Thanks. Anytime. He set the cloth down where the tuner liked to find it. He tugged the bench straight with 2 fingers. He glanced at Sophie, who lifted her sketchbook in wordless confirmation that she was okay. He relaxed an inch. He hadn't noticed the woman standing just inside the door until the room around her seemed to lean a little. Some people know how to enter quietly, without giving up presence. She had on a navy dress that did not apologize for being simple, pearls that did not apologize for being pearls, and a posture that said she was used to being listened to. The few staffers who recognized her straightened reflexively. She wasn't looking at them. She was watching Tony the way a person watches anything they haven't decided about yet. Not with suspicion exactly, with focus. He held her gaze for a polite second, then lowered his eyes. You learn, in buildings like this, when to be visible and when to become part of the wall. Sophie scraped her pencil softly against the paper, adding a shadow where the lid prop met the harp. Dad, she whispered, not looking up. Who is that? Tony didn't answer because he didn't know, and because there was nothing to do about it either way. The woman didn't step forward. She didn't introduce herself. She just stood there, taking in the piano, the man, the child, the cloth on the lid, the way the room had not quite come back to normal. There are moments when a life decides to swivel a degree without telling you. You don't feel the spin until later. You only feel the quiet before it. The stage manager walked to the door to greet the woman, and the corridor outside brightened with a photographer's flash as another guest arrived. Tony reached for the handle on his cart. He glanced at Sophie. She gave him a small nod he felt all the way down in his chest. He started to wheel the cart away when the woman finally moved, not toward the piano, but just enough to see his face better. It wasn't an unfriendly look. It was a look you give a book you might want to read. And then, as the rehearsal room filled with the soft clatter of things being almost ready, the moment landed as lightly as a fingertip on middle C. Maggie Whitmore steps into the room, her gaze fixed curiously on Tony. Come on, Tony. Show us you can do more than polish. Chuck's voice cut through the gala chatter like a blade. The air in the Carnegie Hall ballroom tightened, the way a room does when a storm rolls over a lake and the wind suddenly shifts. Servers in black vests slowed as if the floor had turned to molasses. A string quartet at the far end of the lobby slipped into silence, bows hovering. Phones lifted, polite, curious, a few hungry. Tony stood with one hand on the handle of his supplies cart, the other resting lightly against Sophie's back. He felt her steady pulse under his palm, small and insistent, like a bird's heartbeat. He could have smiled and waved it off. He could have cracked a joke about union rules and timesheets. He could have said, "Not my place, sir," and he did try to start with that simple path. "I'm here to work," he said, voice calm enough to smooth linen. "You'll have a pianist in a few minutes." Chuck turned a quarter step, showing the crowd his profile, letting the chandeliers pick out the silver in his hair. "There's a pianist already," he said, loud enough to carry. "Right there. He caresses the Steinway like a lover. Surely he knows a lullaby or two." A ripple of laughter ran along the nearest group, the way ripples do when they're not quite sure if they should exist. Sophie's fingers bunched the back of Tony's polo, a child's anchor. He shifted just enough that she could see his face. Everything in her eyes asked a single question. "Are we safe?" He lifted his eyebrows once. "We're okay," and then looked back at the piano. It sat in the circle of light like a patient animal, the curve of its rim a shoulder at rest. He had avoided this exact shape of moment for years, skirting it the way you skirt a patch of ice you know will take you down. The stage manager moved toward them, head set crooked, reading the room like the seasoned New Yorker she was. Maggie Whitmore, standing beside a marble column near the center doors, watched without moving. She had the quiet stillness of someone whose attention mattered. Even from across the lobby you could feel it. "Please," someone near Chuck called softly. A woman in a black dress with a thin gold chain. "It would be lovely." Tony felt the old muscle memory stir, the way a leg remembers how to ride a bike, even if your mind insists it forgot. He swallowed. "I'm not the entertainment," he said again, but softer, because he heard Sophie trying not to hold her breath. We should let the program begin." Chuck's smile sharpened. "It already has." Sophie slipped around the cart and took his hand, the sketchbook pressed to her chest like a shield. She didn't tug. She just stood there and let him feel her, as if she were saying, "You don't have to be alone in this part. You never have to be alone in this part again." Something in his chest settled. He looked at the bench. He looked at the little scuffs on the stage riser, the imprint where other feet had stood. He pictured Lauren for a dangerous second, her hair pinned up messily, her eyes laughing when she told him to stop overthinking and just play the phrase, Tony, not the mechanics. Remember what it means. He set the brake on the cart with his shoe. "1 minute," he said, mostly to Sophie. "Then pretzels." Chuck threw his free hand in the air, mock applause. "A minute! A miracle!" The path to the piano was only 8 steps, but they lengthened time. He became keenly aware of small things. The soft hiss of the HVAC, the smell of champagne and floor polish, the faint resin scent lingering from the quartet's bows. The bench felt oddly familiar under his palm, as if all benches were one bench and his body knew their weight. He slid it back an inch because whoever had placed it didn't have his reach. He sat. The audience, as if on cue, arranged themselves into a hush, the kind made by 100 throats closing on a breath. Lights shifted as if the room wanted to see better. He did not crack his knuckles. He did not roll his shoulders. He put both feet flat, found the pedal with the ball of his right foot, and rested his hands above the keys without touching, because touching too soon is a kind of lie. He did not owe them anything, not a scale, not a joke, not a single pretty note to decorate their evening. But he owed Sophie the picture she carried of him, that a man can stand where he is insulted and still choose his own voice. He let his fingers fall. The first sound wasn't grand or showy. It was small, like a door latch easing open somewhere familiar. A low E bloomed, and he shaped it with the pedal until it felt like the beginning of a story told around a kitchen table. His left hand found a slow figure, warm, steady, a heartbeat, while the right traced a line that wasn't a melody so much as a memory. The lobby's marble didn't swallow the sound. It carried it up to the mezzanine and back, a soft tide returning. He wasn't playing anything from a program. If you'd asked him later what the piece was, he wouldn't have been able to name it. It had pieces of the things he used to love. Schumann's patient tenderness, a gospel edge at the turn, the kind of hidden blues you only hear when the sun drops behind a building and the street turns honest. He leaned into a minor chord that always felt like autumn in Queens, long shadows across stoops, kids shouting down the block, a woman humming over a pot of something good. Sophie's shoulders lowered the way a body lowers when a good song finds it. People around the rim of the crowd set their glasses down without looking. A server halfway to the kitchen with a stack of plates forgot to move. The stage manager closed her eyes and let her headset slide to her shoulder. Tony kept it simple, because simple tells the truth faster. He had learned once upon a time how to polish a phrase until it shone like a showroom car, but that didn't interest him now. He wanted the sound to make a place for Sophie to stand. He wanted Lauren to feel near without breaking him. He wanted the man in the charcoal suit to feel something he didn't expect and have to live with it. He approached a cadence and, out of old habit, softened his wrists, letting the line melt instead of click. In his peripheral vision, he could see Maggie Whitmore, hands together, not in prayer, but in focus. He let the middle register carry a little longer than written, if it had been written, then brought the bass up to meet it like two people finding each other at the end of a long day. Chuck shifted, crossed a foot over the other, tried for a smirk, and didn't quite nail it. He looked like someone who had planned to laugh but misplaced the timing. You cannot sneer and listen at the same time. The face doesn't have room. Tony let the right hand lift for a breath and then fell back in with a small figure he sometimes played for Sophie when the apartment was too quiet. 3 notes, like a question, a fourth like an answer, that didn't solve anything but made it bearable. He hadn't shared that with anyone else. You don't expect to share the most private parts of your heart under a chandelier. The sound found the mezzanine again. Up near the framed photographs, an usher ran a thumb under his eye like a man surprised by dust. A woman in a velvet wrap, who had arrived ready to be delighted by other people's money, felt something that wasn't delight exactly, and placed her hand over her chest until it settled. The middle of the piece opened into warmth. He didn't push volume, he let color do the work. He took a small, spare harmony and turned it so the light hit a new edge. You don't need fireworks when you have a steady hand and a story. He thought of Lauren laughing at the burned first batch of pancakes in their old kitchen, the way she chased him with the spatula like she meant to whack him and then kissed his jaw instead. He thought of the hospital room's washed-out light and the doctor's soft voice and the way music had turned to glass inside his throat. He let those things be notes. He didn't fight them back. Sophie stepped closer to the riser, her sketchbook lowered now. She stood as if listening could help carry the weight her dad was hiding, and in a way it did. Music can't change the past, but it can redistribute it, like a hand lifting a heavy box so your back can take a breath. He reached the place where any decent conservatory piece would show off. He did not. He spun a small arpeggio to rinse the air and then dropped back to the pocket where the truth lives. The hall didn't fidget. The phones, for the most part, had lowered, not out of respect for him. Most didn't know him, but out of respect for the feeling growing in the room, which belonged to all of them for a moment. When he finally let the line turn toward home, he thought of the long walk on Queens Boulevard on Sundays, Sophie's hand in his, the way the city hummed without asking for anything. He thought of bagels with too much schmear and the old guy at the corner bodega who always slid Sophie a lollipop like it was contraband. He let those ordinary good things color the last progression, and the chord that would end it waited with patience. He lifted his hands into the hush. Silence isn't empty in a place like this. It gathers meaning from what you've just heard, the way a bowl keeps the shape of soup after it's gone. The chandeliers didn't buzz. The HVAC forgot to exist. For a long blink, all the small noises of a gala were strangers to the room. Sophie's face shone wet. She didn't wipe it. She looked as if she were standing in a patch of sunlight you can't find the source of. Tony did not stand right away. He kept his palms hovering for one extra heartbeat, a private courtesy to Lauren, then rested them gently in his lap. He looked up, Not at Chuck, not yet. But out over the people who had assumed his story and now needed to renegotiate it with themselves. From the back of the crowd came a small, involuntary sound, the kind someone makes when they've remembered their own first piano teacher's living room or a song their mother used to hum over the sink. A man near the double doors coughed to cover his feelings and then decided not to. A young volunteer in a too large blazer started clapping on reflex, a quick staccato that died at once, embarrassed. It wasn't time yet. The room was still traveling back. Chuck found his voice first, but it came out thinner than he intended. "Well," he said, aiming for dry, landing near uncertain. "Surprisingly sentimental." The lobby did not reward him for it. If anything, a few heads snapped in his direction with mild annoyance, as if he'd coughed during a prayer. He retreated a half step, surprised to discover there wasn't much floor behind him. Tony stood, not for applause, but because he had to move. He put one hand on the piano cheek, as if to say thank you to a living thing. He looked for Sophie and found her right where he knew she'd be, brimming and steady at once. He smiled the small version of his smile, the one he used when he didn't dare the bigger one in public. He could have left it there. Nod, cart, pretzels. But he turned, finally, to Chuck. There wasn't anger in it, just a clarity that made the space between them honest. Chuck didn't meet his eyes. He glanced past, toward the bar, toward safer ground. Across the lobby, a photographer lowered his camera, not because he didn't want the shot, but because some moments didn't need a shutter. They needed witness. The quartet at the far end lifted bows, looked at each other, then quietly packed their instruments, as if deciding they, too, had just heard the evening's first real music. At the edge of the marble column, a woman in the navy dress stepped forward. Her hands were still folded, pearls catching the light when she moved. She regarded Tony in a way that made the air feel different, like the first sip of coffee on a cold morning. This wasn't a socialite coming to congratulate the help for a cute trick. This was a person with power, looking at a man as if he were a person with power too, even if he didn't want it. Tony felt his knees remember how to be knees. He nodded once in her direction, a simple courtesy that also served as a thank you to the room for holding him. Then he reached down for his cart's handle because he'd promised a child pretzels, and you don't let promises wait, not after years of making the wrong ones to yourself. The space held its breath a fraction longer, as if the marble wanted to keep the last vibrations a second more. Someone whispered, "Who is he?" And someone else said, "He works here." And both things were true, but neither was complete. He squeezed Sophie's hand. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, cheeks wet. "That was the good kind," she whispered. "What kind?" "The kind that makes your chest feel bigger," she said. "Yeah," he said, and the word came out soft and sure. "Me too." They had taken only 2 steps when the woman at the column, Maggie Whitmore, though he didn't know her name yet, shifted her weight like a decision. Whether she would cross to him or speak or simply mark the moment, he couldn't tell. The room still pressed its silence close, the kind that refuses to be rushed by clumsy clapping or the clink of glass. And then it happened, as simply and cleanly as a note placed just right. Silence hangs after the last note. Then Maggie begins to clap. Autumn in Manhattan had a way of being both tender and sharp. The maples along Broadway had begun their slow turn to amber and crimson, and the air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from the corner carts. At first, the days after Tony Carter's impromptu performance at Carnegie Hall felt almost dreamlike. Local papers ran human interest stories about the janitor pianist, splashing his picture beside glowing headlines. The online videos taken that night, shaky cell phone clips of his quiet grace at the Steinway, spread faster than anyone expected. Sophie carried the printouts to school like prized trading cards, showing her friends the image of her father in the circle of light, hands on the keys. Maggie Whitmore found herself fielding phone calls from reporters, arts organizations, even a few politicians wanting to wrap themselves in the good press of championing hidden talent. But somewhere else in the city, the performance was not being remembered with admiration. For Charles Chuck Whitfield, the man publicly humbled in that same lobby, the night had been a humiliation with teeth. He had built his name in New York's art circles by shaping narratives, deciding who deserved to be celebrated and who did not. And now a man he'd mocked, a man with a mop and a blue polo, had stolen his spotlight. He told himself it wasn't personal. But he also told himself a lot of things that weren't true. The first signs of his pushback were small. Anonymous comments on arts forums, sniffing at the idea that a maintenance man's heartwarming turn could be counted as serious artistry. Then came a couple of unsigned op-eds in niche cultural blogs, the kind that circulated among donors and board members. The language was always careful, plausible enough to pass for professional opinion. Sentiment is not skill. Audiences mustn't confuse a tearjerker with a masterclass. When those didn't dim the glow, Chuck used his connections with a pair of columnists who owed him favors. A week later, 2 larger publications ran features that questioned Tony's background, painting him as a man who had walked away from the stage in failure and was now leveraging pity for a second act. The headlines were like stones lobbed through a window. From mop to music, a manufactured inspiration story. Janitor turned pianist. How far can sympathy take you? Tony didn't read them at first, but the city had a way of putting the words in front of you whether you wanted them or not. Folded papers left on subway seats, headlines blaring from TV screens in the corner of a bodega. He found himself closing magazines halfway through a paragraph, jaw tight. The backlash wasn't confined to print. A trickle of anonymous emails began showing up in the general inbox at Carnegie Hall, some forwarded to him with a shrug from the building's admin staff. A couple were ugly enough that Sophie couldn't see them. Twice, while buying groceries, Tony heard strangers make sideways remarks just loud enough to be heard, about cleaning up nicely or milking the sympathy circuit. Maggie noticed the change in him before he spoke of it. The easy humor she'd seen in small flashes was quieter now. He moved like a man carrying something he couldn't set down. One afternoon, she stopped by the hall's service corridor. He was sitting at the old upright in the maintenance room, hands resting on the keys but not pressing down. "I heard about the articles," she said softly. He didn't look up. Maybe they're right. Maybe one night in the spotlight was enough. It's a long way from a lobby to a stage that counts. She sat on the bench beside him, close enough for their shoulders to touch. "Tony, you didn't ask for the spotlight. You answered a dare with dignity, and you played from your life. That's not something people get to decide the worth of. They're scared because you don't fit in their boxes." He let out a small, dry laugh. "Scared? Chuck Whitfield doesn't scare easy." "No," she said, "but he knows what happens when the audience starts writing their own story instead of reading his." The next morning, Maggie made a decision. She called in a few favors of her own and arranged a press event at Lincoln Center. The plaza's white stone reflected the crisp October sun as reporters gathered under the tall arches, cameras already trained on the podium she'd had set up. When the microphones lit red, she didn't waste time. "Anthony Carter is not a gimmick," she said, her voice carrying across the open space. "He is not a charity project. He is a musician whose talent speaks louder than the prejudice of those who would silence him. His past job title has nothing to do with the value of his art, and the attempts to diminish him are a disservice to this city's cultural life." A few reporters glanced toward the back, where Chuck himself had shown up, arms folded, a thin smile playing at the corner of his mouth. One journalist asked, "Miss Whitmore, what do you say to those who argue Mr. Carter's recent attention is more about his story than his skill?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "I say those people can't tell the difference between a headline and a human being. And I'd remind them that Mr. Carter's story is his skill. Every note he plays is shaped by the life he's lived. The only manufacture here is in the false narrative being spread by certain critics. There was a murmur through the crowd, the kind that hinted at tomorrow's pull quotes. Chuck's jaw twitched, but he stayed silent. Maggie went further, announcing the launch of a community music program in Central Park, free outdoor concerts featuring artists who'd been shut out of traditional venues because of prejudice or economic barriers. "Talent doesn't live only in practice rooms and conservatories," she said. "It lives in every neighborhood of this city, and we're going to prove it." Tony, watching from the edge of the plaza with Sophie's small hand in his, felt something uncoil in his chest. The fight wasn't his alone anymore. Over the next weeks, the program took shape. Flyers appeared on lampposts. Social media buzzed with announcements of the lineup. Some of the same people who'd doubted him began sending messages asking when and where he'd play again. The afternoon of the first concert dawned brisk and clear. Central Park's lawns were speckled with gold leaves, and the smell of hot dogs and kettle corn drifted from vendor carts. A small stage had been set up near Bethesda Terrace, its black grand piano gleaming in the sun. Folding chairs filled quickly, and a ring of standing listeners formed behind them. Backstage, Tony ran a hand along the piano's rim. He could hear the other performers finishing their sets, a gospel singer from Harlem, a violinist who busked on the 6 train, a jazz trio from Queens. "You ready, Dad?" Sophie asked, eyes bright above the scarf wrapped around her neck. He hesitated, feeling the old tug of doubt. Then he caught sight of Maggie standing at the edge of the crowd, hands tucked into her coat, giving him the smallest nod. When his name was called, he walked to the bench. The late afternoon light slanted across the keys. He took a breath, placed his fingers, and began to play. The music was warmer than the October air, unhurried but certain. He wove fragments of the city into the melody, the rhythm of subway wheels, the lilt of a street saxophone, the hush of snow on brownstone steps. People who'd never met him swayed where they stood. In the shadow of an elm, Chuck Whitfield stood with his coat collar up, watching. For once, he didn't have an audience to play to. The applause, when it came, was not for him, and he didn't try to take it. When the last chord faded, the crowd rose to its feet. Maggie stepped forward, taking the microphone. "This," she said, gesturing toward Tony, "is what New York is when it's at its best. Talent without prejudice, art without gatekeepers." Tony stood, nodded to the crowd, and found Sophie beaming in the front row. Whatever came next, this was a night no whisper campaign could take away. Cameras flashed as Maggie stepped up to the podium, her voice steady, but her eyes blazing. The fountain at Lincoln Center threw its white water into the bright October air, each arc catching sunlight like bent glass. Reporters clustered beneath the arches, shoulders huddled against a crisp breeze that smelled faintly of pretzels and hot coffee from the carts lined along the plaza. Tripods clicked open. Boom mics angled toward the lectern Maggie's team had arranged in front of the steps. The banners behind her read simply, "Art belongs to everyone." Tony stood half a staircase down with Sophie, who had both hands wrapped around a paper cup of cocoa too big for them. She looked up at the massive facade of the Metropolitan Opera House, then at her father. "Does this count as outside?" she whispered, seeing her breath fog the air. "It does," he said, nestling the cup tighter between her palms. "Best seat in the house, too." He hadn't planned on being here. He hadn't planned on a lot of things lately. But when Maggie had called that morning, "If you can come, I'd like you to be here, not hidden in the back. We're not hiding, Tony." He'd said yes before the old reflex to decline could catch up. The plaza murmured the way a room does before the first note. The stage manager, because every public moment has someone like her, checked the handheld mic, nodded to a cameraman, and stepped aside. Maggie adjusted the pearls at her throat as if anchoring herself to a promise, then leaned toward the microphones. "Good afternoon," she said, and the plaza gave the syllables back with interest. "Thank you for coming on short notice. I asked you here because something true is being twisted, and this city deserves better than that." A rustle from the press pool, pens poised, lenses trained. Two pigeons hopped along a balustrade as if taking their own notes. Maggie's gaze skimmed the gathered faces, not searching for friends or enemies, simply registering the audience that would carry her words across town by dinner. "Over the last week, you've read opinions about Anthony Carter," she continued. "You've seen phrases like manufactured sympathy and stunt. You've seen his former job title used like a cage. I'm here to tell you that what he did in Carnegie Hall's lobby wasn't a trick. It was music. And music that honest doesn't ask permission from anyone's prejudice." She didn't point. She didn't need to. At the rear edge of the cluster, Charles "Chuck" Whitfield stood with his arms folded, coat collar up, looking like a man who'd invented the weather and found it a disappointment. He wore the same thin smile he used on opening nights when a performance had not lived up to his sentence. The camera nearest him caught the line of his jaw and the watch he'd chosen to show. A reporter in a navy peacoat raised his hand. "Ms. Whitmore, Aaron Feld with the Post. You're not a music critic. On what basis do you challenge, well, the critics?" Maggie's mouth curved, not a smile exactly, an acknowledgement that questions had jobs too. "On the basis of being a listener," she said, "and a citizen of this city. You don't need a credential to recognize sincerity when you hear it. That night, Mr. Carter didn't perform a sob story. He played, and the people in that lobby, donors and ushers and caterers and students, heard themselves in it. That's what art is supposed to do." Another voice, this one from a woman with a tablet tucked under her arm. "But some would argue that narrative is driving this more than talent." "Story and talent are not enemies," Maggie said. "They're partners. Music without life is sterile. Life without music is—" She searched for a word and landed on one that fit like wool. "Lonely." The fountain hissed as if in agreement. Arms lifted, more questions. "What do you say to those who claim Mr. Carter abandoned music years ago? Are you leveraging this moment for your foundation's brand? Is this an attack on free criticism? The usual pack choreography: build a shape, then pull it apart." Maggie did not flinch. "He didn't abandon music," she said, voice steady. "He lost his wife. He chose to raise his daughter with the job he could get, while his heart learned to breathe again. Most of us don't do our best living on a public stage." She let that settle. "And as for brands, I'm standing here because someone with influence used it to make a smaller person feel smaller. That's not criticism. That's cruelty. New York can be better." The lenses swung for a shot of Chuck. He put on the expression of a man politely surprised to find himself on camera. A younger reporter, less practiced at swallowing his impulse, called back toward him, "Mr. Whitfield, care to respond?" The question skittered over the stone. Chuck waited half a beat, always a half beat, before coming forward, the crowd opening for him automatically, the muscle memory of deference. "If we're now policing tone," he said mildly, "I'm happy to have my prose audited, but I'm not sure we're here to have our feelings massaged, Ms. Whitmore. We're here to talk about art, aren't we?" "Exactly," Maggie said. "Let's talk about art." She stepped slightly aside from the podium, freeing her hands. "Art is the point. But art doesn't bloom only in credentialed greenhouses. It grows in church basements and subway platforms, in apartments where people practice quietly so they don't wake the baby. The concert halls are custodians, not gatekeepers." She let her eyes rest on Tony for a second, a touch only he felt. "And when someone from the custodial staff happens to be an artist, the right response is not contempt. It's curiosity." A different murmur moved through the press, one that contained agreement. Two crew members at a TV van exchanged a look like, "Yeah, that." Sophie pressed her cocoa into her dad's hands and tugged at his sleeve. Is she talking about you?" He lowered his voice. "Maybe she's talking about a whole lot of people." Maggie shifted gears. "I didn't ask you all here just to correct a narrative," she said, and the microphones leaned closer. "I asked you here to invite this city to something better. Beginning this weekend, The Whitmore Foundation is sponsoring a series of free community concerts in Central Park. We're calling it Voices of the City. Performers will include classically trained musicians who've stepped away from the stage, artists who've been overlooked because of where they're from or how they look, and yes, working people who make music after their shifts. If you want to judge, come judge with your ears. A ripple of interest. Fingers flew across phone screens as event notices were drafted on the spot. A blogger live tweeted the name of the series. Someone asked which meadow, which time. A publicist at Maggie's shoulder murmured logistics into a mic and held up a small placard. Sunday, 3 p.m., Bethesda Terrace. From the staircase, Tony watched as the idea took shape in the air, visible almost like the ghost of a structure you knew would stand by nightfall. He felt the old mix of hope and dread. Hope that sound could be enough, dread that some people never wanted it to be. A hand went up near the front. "Will Mr. Carter perform?" It was a simple question, the kind that carried more weight than it needed to. Maggie did not answer for him. She looked toward the stairs the way a good host looks toward the guest of honor when someone asks for a toast he hasn't decided to give. Tony felt the crowd turn, felt his name pass from person to person like a folded note. Sophie's small fingers found his again, warm through his jacket sleeve. He wasn't ready to make promises in public. He wasn't afraid of playing. He was afraid of becoming someone else's headline again. He lifted his chin and gave the smallest of nods, enough to say, "I'll meet you there." A few people clapped in the wrong place, the way they do when they can't help themselves. Chuck's smile tightened. "So we're crowdsourcing curation now," he said, directing his voice toward the nearest microphone without looking at it. "Democracy at the expense of standards." "Standards aren't a private club," Maggie said, calm as ice water. "They're a living conversation, and New York knows how to talk." A gust ran across the plaza, flipping the corner of a reporter's notebook. The fountain pitched a little higher, catching a nurse on her lunch break in a spray that made her laugh. A violinist who'd come to watch — it's hard to keep musicians from gathering at a hint of music — lifted his instrument for a quick, cheeky run of notes. The plaza answered with a few scattered claps. The city was doing what it always did, making itself up as it went along. A veteran TV anchor, gray at the temples and steady of tone, asked quietly, "Ms. Whitmore, aren't you worried about making an enemy of a critic with Mr. Whitfield's reach?" Maggie looked straight into his camera. "I'm worried about making an enemy of my conscience," she said. "Mr. Whitfield can keep his reach. I'll keep my principles." It wasn't grandstanding. It landed because she meant it. The anchor lowered his mic with a nod, like a man who'd been reminded why he took this job in the first place. The questions thinned. The plaza's energy shifted from combative to conversational. Someone started handing out programs for Sunday's concert. A tourist couple wandered into the edge of the crowd and stayed. A janitorial crew from across the avenue, still in day shirts, paused with their brooms and gave Tony the kind of once-over that isn't envy or pity, but recognition. Maggie signaled her team to wrap. "Thank you for your time," she said into the mic. "I hope we'll see you in the park. Bring your ears. Bring your neighbors." So she stepped back. The lights on the microphones winked off. For a second, the plaza felt like a stage just after the curtain, a hush, then the rustle of real life returning. Reporters surged toward the steps to snag quotes. Maggie answered a few more, then excused herself with practiced grace and moved down toward Tony and Sophie. Up close, the force in her face looked less like anger and more like care. "You okay?" she asked. Tony searched for a light answer and then let it go. "Yes," he said, "better than I was this morning." Sophie shifted her cocoa to her other hand. "You sounded brave," she told Maggie with the absolute authority of 8 years old. Maggie laughed, a quick, surprised sound, and bent a little to Sophie's level. "I practiced on the cab ride over," she said. "It helps when you know who you're fighting for." Sophie considered that like a scientist. "We can help pack programs on Sunday," she offered. "I'm good at stacks." "Then we'll need you," Maggie said. "Both of you." She straightened. No pressure about playing, she added to Tony, voice dropping. You say yes because you want to, not because anyone pushed you into it. He nodded. Thank you. A producer from a morning show slid in, all smiles and speed. Ms. Whitmore, can we get you live tomorrow? And Mr. Carter, if you're willing. Tomorrow is busy, Maggie said, which was her way of saying no. Sunday is the story. Come here for yourselves. They moved away from the knot of cameras, down the steps to the plaza, where the wind smelled less like cables and more like city. The fountain hissed its endless S, throwing back the afternoon sun. Out past the cameras, at the outer ring of the dispersing crowd, Chuck Whitfield didn't follow. He stayed where he was for a long moment, the expression on his face no longer curated for anyone's lens. It wasn't confusion exactly, it was calculation, the mental habit of a man who'd gotten his way by reading which way rooms leaned and then leaning harder. He glanced at the banners, then at the staircase where Tony stood. Something narrowed in his gaze, not fatigue, not surrender, something that said, "This isn't over." A gust lifted the lapel of his coat and then let it fall flat again. He turned his wrist, checked a watch he had no need to check, and let his mouth return to that practiced line. The plaza, catching only the outline of him, moved on to the next thing, as New York always does. From the sidelines, Chuck's narrowed eyes signal he's not finished. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the streets of New York slick with reflections of neon signs and early traffic lights. From a fourth-floor window overlooking Lexington Avenue, Marcus Reed watched the city wake up. He had learned to read the rhythm of these mornings. Delivery trucks rumbling past, shopkeepers lifting metal shutters, the aroma of fresh bagels drifting in through an open window. Yet today felt different. The air carried a strange quietness, as if the city itself were holding its breath. A week had passed since the community concert in the park. In that short time, Marcus's performance had somehow slipped beyond the neighborhood, beyond even the city. Clips had surfaced online, amateur videos shot on shaky phones, and in them his music seemed to breathe on its own, a melody born from grief and struggle. It resonated in strangers he would never meet. The phone calls began, not from agents or record companies, that world had long since stopped calling his name, but from ordinary people. A teacher in the Bronx whose students replayed his song during art class. A subway operator who swore the melody made him slow the train just to listen. A mother from Atlanta who said her son, too shy to speak in class, had found the courage to play piano for the first time after hearing Marcus's story. They all said the same thing, in voices tinged with hope. "You reminded me, I'm more than what the world calls me." On a Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn Harper invited Marcus to join her at a small public radio station in the Lower East Side. The host, a man named Leo Torres, had built a loyal following with his late-night program, Voices of the City. It was less an interview show than a patchwork quilt of human stories, stitched together with warmth and music. Inside the dim, cozy studio, walls lined with vinyl records, Leo greeted Marcus with the kind of handshake that felt like an embrace. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "Your story. It's already moving through the streets. I just want to let folks hear it in your own words." When the red light above the microphone blinked on, Leo leaned in. "Tonight," he began, voice low and inviting, "we bring you a story about a man who thought his music was gone forever, until life found a way to give it back. Marcus Reed, welcome." Marcus hesitated, glancing through the glass at Evelyn and Maya, who sat watching with quiet smiles. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'm honored to be here." Leo asked nothing about fame, nothing about chart positions or critics. Instead, he spoke about pianos in old churches, the sound of rain on subway grates, and the feeling of holding on when the world tries to push you under. Slowly, Marcus' voice grew steadier. He spoke of Rachel, not just her loss, but her laughter, her habit of humming off-key while folding laundry. He spoke of Maya, the way she had become his anchor. And yes, he spoke of Vincent Moore, though not with bitterness. "People can try to take your dignity," Marcus said, "but they can't touch the music inside you, unless you let them." The next morning, the station's inbox overflowed. Messages arrived from truck drivers in Ohio, retirees in Arizona, college students in Seoul, strangers whose only common thread was that they had been stopped in their tracks by Marcus's story. One note, written in careful cursive on stationery, simply read, "Your music found the part of me I thought I'd lost. Thank you for bringing it home." Evelyn saw it first and quietly slipped it into Marcus's jacket pocket. As weeks passed, invitations began to arrive, not for grand stages, but for places that mattered more: a veterans center in Queens, a shelter in Newark, a library in Harlem. Marcus accepted them all. He played for rooms of 20 people and for crowds spilling into the street, never changing his tone or his purpose. And everywhere he went, the voices of the city followed, people leaning in after a song to share their own small victories, their own long-forgotten dreams. Some cried, some laughed, but all left with lighter steps. One chilly evening, after a performance at a tiny cafe in Brooklyn, a young boy approached, clutching a battered keyboard under his arm. "I want to play like you," he said. "Not just the notes, the heart part." Marcus knelt, his smile gentle. "The heart part is already in you," he replied. "All you have to do is let it out." From her place in the corner, Evelyn watched the exchange with quiet pride. She understood now that Marcus's journey had grown larger than either of them. This wasn't just about reclaiming a career, it was about reclaiming a space in the world where every voice mattered, no matter how the city tried to drown it out. That night, as they drove back across the Manhattan Bridge, the skyline glittering ahead, Maya leaned forward from the back seat. "Daddy," she said, "you know what I think?" "What's that, sweetheart?" "I think the city's singing with you now." Marcus glanced at Evelyn, who smiled knowingly, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it was true. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope, heavy with embossed lettering that felt like it belonged in someone else's life. Inside, on thick cardstock, were the words, "The Whitmore Foundation, Annual Winter Gala, Lincoln Center." Beneath the formal typeface was a handwritten line in blue ink, "Tony, this time you'll be on the program." M. Tony Carter stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't that he didn't believe Maggie would follow through. He'd learned by now she didn't say things she didn't mean. But Lincoln Center wasn't Central Park, and it sure wasn't the Carnegie Lobby. This was a place where audiences came dressed for perfection, expecting it in return. The weeks leading up to the gala felt like walking a narrow bridge. Word of his appearance had circulated in the arts community, drawing curiosity, encouragement, and, he could feel it, quiet skepticism. Chuck Whitfield had kept his distance since the Plaza confrontation, but Tony knew men like him didn't simply fade away. He practiced at night, after Sophie went to bed, the notes spilling through their small apartment while the city murmured outside. He didn't rehearse for technical fireworks. He worked on tone, phrasing, breath, on making every note mean something. Evelyn dropped by with coffee and the occasional sharp truth. "Don't play to prove them wrong," she told him. "Play so there's nothing left to doubt." On the night of the gala, Lincoln Center was dressed like a jewel box. White lights wrapped the plaza trees, and the fountain threw arcs of water high into the crisp winter air. The guests swept in under the tall glass facade, their coats flashing with satin linings, shoes clicking on stone. Backstage, Tony adjusted the cuffs of his black jacket, borrowed but tailored enough to feel like it belonged for the evening. Sophie peeked out from behind the curtain, eyes wide at the sight of so many people gathering. "You nervous?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "A little." "You always tell me," she said, "if you know the story, you can tell it without being scared." He laughed softly. "That's true." Then just tell it. The program began with orchestral pieces, then a soprano, whose high notes floated like glass in the air. After a brief intermission, Maggie stepped to the microphone in a deep navy gown, the house lights softening around her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "our next performer is someone who reminds us that music belongs to all of us, not just the few who get invited to play it. Please welcome Anthony Carter." The applause started polite, as gala applause often does. Tony walked out into the light, feeling the stage's polished wood under his shoes. The Steinway waited at center stage, gleaming under the spotlights. He sat, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. He began not with a bold flourish, but with a low, warm chord, a sound that seemed to breathe into the space. From there, the melody unfolded like a conversation. Patient, intimate, drawing the room closer. He wove threads of gospel and blues into classical lines, a musical bridge between the worlds he'd walked through. In the third row, Sophie sat forward, sketchbook in her lap. Evelyn, beside her, kept her eyes fixed on him, the corners of her mouth curved in quiet encouragement. Halfway through, he shifted into a piece Rachel had loved, unannounced, unplanned. The notes carried a private weight, but he didn't play them for grief. He played them for connection, for the way a shared memory can still live in the present. By the final cadence, the room had gone still. The last chord hung in the air, then dissolved into silence that felt almost physical. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the applause rose, not the polite kind, but the standing kind, swelling from front to back. Backstage, Maggie met him with both hands on his shoulders. "You didn't just play, Tony. You owned that room." He exhaled, tension finally leaving his body. "Thank you, for getting me here." "Don't thank me," she said. "You walked out there yourself." Out in the lobby, guests approached with handshakes and praise. Some were genuine admirers. Others, Tony could tell, were recalculating their opinions in real time. And then, through the crowd, came Chuck Whitfield. He stopped just short of Tony, eyes unreadable. "Well," Chuck said, "seems the city's decided you belong after all." Tony met his gaze. Didn't need the city to decide, just needed to play. For once, Chuck had no ready answer. He gave the smallest nod, then drifted back into the crowd. Later, as the night wound down, Tony and Sophie stepped out into the cold air of the plaza. The fountain still danced, lit from below. She slipped her hand into his. "You told the story," she said. He looked up at the winter sky. "Yeah," he said softly, "and I think they finally heard it." They walked toward the avenue, the city's hum wrapping around them, not as noise, but as music. There's a quiet kind of light that lingers after a night like the one at Lincoln Center. You could see it in the way people left the hall, speaking softly, holding their coats a little tighter, as if they wanted to keep some of that music with them. For Tony, it wasn't about the applause or the marble columns. It was about the faces in the crowd, neighbors, strangers, and members of the Black community who had stood with him from the beginning, carrying his story as if it were part of their own. Over 6 chapters of this journey, we've seen more than a man reclaim a stage. We've watched dignity held in quiet hands and the steady courage to walk into a room where some still doubted he belonged. There was no shouting down of enemies, no grand revenge. Instead, there was the slow, certain work of proving, through music, through presence, that worth is not decided by job titles or polished resumes. In that audience sat children from the Black community, elders who remembered other battles, and people who had never set foot in a concert hall until that night. They all heard the same thing. The truth played out in notes that needed no translation. The lesson here is simple but not small. Hold fast to your dignity, and stand for your truth with a steady, human grace. In doing so, you're not just winning justice, you're building something finer from the pieces of what tried to break you. Life has a way of testing our place in it, and it's easy to let other voices decide our value. But like a porch light left on in the dark, a single act of kindness or a single honest performance can guide more people home than we'll ever know. It's worth remembering that the Black community, like so many others, carries stories of being underestimated, of being judged before being known. When someone steps forward to answer that judgment with art, it's not only a personal victory, it's a communal one. And the beauty is, you don't have to be on a stage to live it out. You can do it in the way you speak up for a neighbor, the way you refuse to repeat a false story, the way you show up when someone's worth is being questioned. So maybe tonight, take a few minutes to think about the people in your own life who've been quietly holding their ground and what it might mean to stand beside them. Share a story, pass along a song, or simply listen without judgment. Because if this tale has touched your heart, perhaps its warmth can be carried farther, to a friend, a neighbor, or someone in your own circle who could use a reminder that they matter. And who knows, someday when you least expect it, you might find yourself in the presence of another ordinary person whose truth, like Tony's, plays the kind of music that stays with you long after the final note.